She was an innocent virgin. He was a mature millionaire, but on the first night she surprised. What do you think a shy girl can do to forever change the life of a powerful man? The answer will completely shock you. Where are you watching from? If you want to find out what happened that night, subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Sophie trembled like a California grapevine as she climbed the marble staircase leading to the master bedroom of the mansion. Her white silk dress rustled with each step, echoing through corridors adorned with contemporary American art and wrought iron chandeliers. At 22, she had never even kissed a man, and now she was married to Thomas, a 48-year-old entrepreneur who owned one of the largest fortunes in Napa Valley. The most unexpected marriages are sometimes those in which souls find their deepest resonance. Her grandmother had whispered the night before the wedding, with that enigmatic look that always seemed to see beyond appearances. The marriage had been arranged by the families, a tradition still preserved in certain circles of Sonoma, where alliances between vineyards were worth more than the fleeting feelings of youth. She, the daughter of renowned winemakers famous for their Cabernet Sauvignon, with notes of hazelnut and citrus. He, a telecommunications magnate who had returned to his Californian roots after 20 years of entrepreneurial conquests in New York. The last rays of autumn sunlight filtered through century-old stained glass, casting amber patterns on the stone walls. Outside, the vineyards stretched as far as the eye could see, their leaves reddened by the season heralding an exceptional harvest. The symbolism wasn't lost on Sophie. She too was about to be harvested, at the peak of her youth. Arriving before the imposing solid oak door, she paused, breathing deeply the scent of beeswax and lavender that permeated the mansion. She adjusted a rebellious strand of her chestnut hair, smooth as silk, which cascaded to the middle of her back. Her delicate hands, accustomed to caressing the ivory keys of the piano, hesitated a moment before knocking. On the other side, Thomas stood motionless before the window, contemplating the purple horizon. His reflection in the glass showed a man whose features, chiseled by experience, contrasted with a new vulnerability in his gaze. This union wasn't merely strategic for him. After 2 decades of voluntary solitude dedicated to building an empire, something had awakened in him when he first glimpsed Sophie playing absently with a kitten in the courtyard of her family estate. An innocence he believed forever lost. 3 discreet knocks resonated against the wood. Thomas turned slowly, mechanically adjusting the collar of his white shirt, unbuttoned just enough to suggest intimacy to come without imposing it. "Come in," he said, his voice gentle. The door opened, revealing Sophie on the threshold, a slender silhouette haloed by the light from the corridor. What neither of them knew yet was that in just a few hours, this supposed innocence would reveal a transformative power that no one could have imagined. The first surprise came when Thomas, returning from a late phone call with Tokyo, opened the bedroom door and found Sophie seated at the grand piano that decorated the corner of the room. Her delicate hands glided over the keys with a mastery that made Gershwin accessible as a whispered confidence. The notes of Rhapsody in Blue flowed like water from the Rockies, filling the space with an emotion so pure that he felt tears rise to his eyes. He remained motionless in the doorway, fearing that the slightest movement might break the spell. The Art Deco lamp cast a golden halo on her profile, accentuating the delicate curve of her neck, the concentration that slightly furrowed her brow. She played with half-closed eyes, as if in a trance, her entire body seeming to breathe with the music. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he finally asked, his voice slightly husky with emotion. Sophie started, her fingers freezing on a suspended note. Her cheeks instantly flushed, as if she had been caught in a moment of intimacy. "My grandmother taught me," she answered, lowering her eyes to the ivory keys, "but I've never played for anyone but her." Thomas approached slowly, like one would approach a rare bird ready to fly away. "Why hide it?" he asked gently, sitting at the edge of the bench, maintaining a respectful distance. Sophie brushed a key, producing an isolated note that vibrated in the silence. "My father considers music a frivolous distraction," she murmured. "He says a woman from Sonoma should know wine, not Leonard Bernstein." Thomas felt indignation rising within him. How could such talent be stifled? He observed her hands, fine, expressive, with fingers slightly longer than average, perfect for the instrument. "Would you play for me?" he asked, surprised by his own vulnerability. "Please." She finally raised her eyes to him, and he saw a gleam, not of timidity as he expected, but of determination. Without a word, she straightened slightly, pushed a strand of hair behind her ear and began to play. This time it wasn't Gershwin, but Chopin, the Nocturne in E-flat major, interpreted with such intensity that the air seemed to vibrate around them. Thomas closed his eyes, overwhelmed. At that precise moment, he realized he had married not just an innocent young woman, but an exceptional artist who hid her light out of obligation rather than modesty. When the last note faded, a silence charged with emotion settled between them. Sophie waited, hands resting on her knees, her face turned toward him with an unspoken question. "Tomorrow," said Thomas, rising, "we'll bring in a tuner. This piano deserves to be perfect for your fingers." That night they slept on opposite sides of the vast four-poster bed, but an invisible bridge had begun to be built between them, founded on the unexpected foundations of art and respect. Dawn slipped through the half-open shutters, painting golden stripes on the linen sheets. Thomas awoke to the discreet but unusual sound of dishes clinking. The place beside him was empty, the cold sheets testifying to a prolonged absence. Following the sounds to the mansion's kitchen, a monumental room with industrial stoves that usually only the chef used, he discovered Sophie in full creative effervescence. Dressed in a simple pale blue dressing gown, her hair tied in a messy bun, she navigated between the marble countertops with the assurance of an orchestra conductor. The aroma of freshly roasted coffee mingled with the subtler, more enticing scent of homemade cookies fresh from the oven. On the central counter stood bowls of colorful jams, scarlet raspberry, amber apricot, ruby currant. "You cook?" he asked, unable to mask his surprise. Sophie turned, a slight trace of flour on her cheek. Her spontaneous smile caught him off guard. "The cookies are my great-grandmother's specialty," she explained, pulling a new batch from the oven. "She used to say that pastry is a form of diplomacy. You conquer hearts through the stomach before even opening your mouth." Thomas approached, inhaling the delicate aroma of lemon and vanilla. He took one, still warm, and the airy texture melting on his tongue drew a murmur of approval. "It's extraordinary," he admitted, suddenly realizing that for years he had been eating without really tasting. "The secret is patience," Sophie confided, pouring coffee into antique porcelain cups. "The dough needs to rest for at least 12 hours. Like good marriages, right? They need time." The remark, pronounced with disarming innocence, made him smile despite himself. She had this way of speaking profound truths without seeming to. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, watching her meticulously arrange the cookies on a silver tray. "I know," she replied simply, "but I wanted to. This mansion is magnificent, but it lacks a soul, warmth." During the following weeks, life in the mansion gradually transformed. Sophie rose before dawn to play the piano in the library, where the first rays of sunlight danced between the oak shelves. The household staff, initially disconcerted by her presence in spaces usually reserved for servants, began to appreciate her attentions. A kind word here, a question about their family there. The cold, formal atmosphere gradually gave way to something more alive. Fresh flowers appeared in every room. Books previously aligned like soldiers were found open on tables, inviting reading. The curtains, perpetually drawn to protect the furniture from the sun, opened to let in the California light. Thomas observed this metamorphosis with a mixture of fascination and unease. Part of him feared that these changes might disturb the perfect order he had spent years establishing. Another part, which he was just discovering, was curiously invigorated by this intrusion of life into his meticulously organized existence. One morning, as he worked in his study, he heard bursts of laughter from the garden. Through the window he glimpsed Sophie conversing in Spanish with the old Mexican gardener whom everyone considered a taciturn rustic. They were discussing animatedly, the old man gesturing towards the rose bushes while she nodded, taking notes in a small notebook. "I didn't know you spoke Spanish," he remarked that evening during dinner. "Oh, just a few phrases," she downplayed. "I learned by reading Garcia Marquez in the original text. Translations lose so much of the original musicality." Thomas slowly set down his fork, looking at her with renewed curiosity. Who really was this young woman he had married for convenience? And how many more surprises did she still have in store for him? The vineyard attached to the mansion required constant attention. Thomas, despite his theoretical knowledge of wine, usually delegated all decisions to the cellar master. However, one October morning, while the harvest was in full swing, a dispute erupted between the seasonal workers and the production manager. "They refuse to harvest the east slope," explained the foreman, visibly irritated. "They claim the grapes aren't ready, but the analysis says otherwise. We'll fall behind on the entire schedule." Thomas was about to decide in favor of science when Sophie, who had been listening silently, intervened. "May I see these vines?" she asked softly. The foreman gave her a condescending look. "Ma'am, this is a technical matter that—" "I would like to see these vines," she repeated, with unexpected firmness. An hour later, all three stood on the contested slope. Sophie knelt in the ochre earth, ignoring her silk dress trailing in the dust. She took a bunch in her hand, carefully observed the berries, then crushed one between her fingers, sniffing the aroma before cautiously tasting. "These grapes need 3 more days," she declared. "The analyses may show the right sugar level, but the tannins aren't ripe. The wine would be astringent." The foreman let out a short laugh. "With all due respect, ma'am, you are—" "The granddaughter of Richard Miller," completed Thomas, suddenly remembering. "The man who revolutionized Californian viticulture in the 70s. Sophie simply nodded. "My grandfather took me through the vineyards since I learned to walk. He said machines can measure, but only hands can feel the soul of the grape." This revelation subtly changed the dynamic between them. That evening, for the first time, they dined on the terrace overlooking the vineyards, rather than in the formal dining room. Thomas opened a rare bottle from the cellar, a vintage created by Sophie's grandfather. "Why did you never tell me about your wine heritage?" he asked, serving her a glass. Sophie contemplated the ruby liquid in the candlelight. "No one ever asked me," she replied simply. "People see what they expect to see. A young woman without experience, a trophy wife." Thomas took the hit, painfully recognizing the truth in these words. Wasn't that exactly how he had perceived her? "What would you like to do with the vineyards?" he asked, surprising Sophie as much as himself with this opening. Her eyes lit up, and for the next 2 hours she outlined innovative ideas on biodynamic viticulture, integrating traditional methods with modern technologies, and a vision for wines that would tell the unique story of their terroir. Thomas listened, fascinated not only by her knowledge but by the passion that animated each of her words. He realized that before him was not the decorative wife he thought he had chosen, but a potential partner whose intelligence and sensitivity could bring a new dimension to everything he undertook. At the end of the evening, as the moon rose above the hills, Thomas made a decision that would change the course of their relationship. "I want you to take charge of the vineyards," he declared, "entirely. Make of them what your instinct tells you." Sophie looked at him for a long time, searching for the trap or condescension in his gaze. Finding only sincerity, she nodded, sealing a tacit pact between them. What neither of them knew yet was that this decision would mark the beginning of a silent revolution that would extend far beyond the vines. The second revelation came when Sophie timidly asked to visit Thomas's New York offices. Her request surprised him. Until then, she had shown no interest in his telecommunications empire, preferring to focus her energy on transforming the vineyard estate. "You'd be bored," he had initially responded, imagining her discomfort among the sharks of finance and technocrats. Perhaps, she had conceded with that half-smile that was beginning to fascinate him. "But how would I know without trying?" A week later, they landed in New York, greeted by the customary frenzy of the metropolis. Sophie, dressed in a navy blue suit that highlighted her honey-colored eyes, observed everything with quiet curiosity. The headquarters, a glass and steel tower in Midtown Manhattan, impressed most visitors. She, however, seemed more interested in the people than the architecture. Thomas had introduced her summarily to his directors, expecting her to spend her days shopping or visiting museums. To his great surprise, she appeared each morning in his office, notebook in hand, asking to observe different departments. On the third day, while attending a meeting on Asian expansion strategy, Sophie, who had remained silent until then, posed a question that froze the assembly. "Your market analysis is impressive," she said to the financial director who had just finished his presentation, "but have you considered the cultural impact of this approach in the rural regions of Vietnam? Their relationship with technology is fundamentally different from that of urban centers." An embarrassed silence followed. The financial director, a man in his 50s accustomed to intimidating his interlocutors, shot an annoyed glance at Thomas. "Madam perhaps refers to environmental concerns," he suggested condescendingly, "but I assure you that our impact studies—" "I'm referring to the sociological work of Nguyen Van Min on technological adoption in traditional communities," Sophie interrupted him with a gentle but firm voice. "His research suggests that the one-size-fits-all approach you're proposing might encounter significant resistance, not from rejection of modernity, but from attachment to modes of communication that privilege community bonds." This time, the silence was of a different nature. Thomas observed with fascination the expressions around the table, surprise, confusion, and in some, nascent respect. "I studied cultural anthropology by correspondence," she confessed later, as they shared a gourmet meal on the terrace of their suite with a view of Central Park. "I always dreamed of making a difference in the business world, but I never imagined I would have the opportunity." Thomas looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "Why did you never pursue this path?" Sophie rotated her wineglass between her fingers, observing the amber reflections. "My father considered higher education for women superfluous. A good marriage is worth more than all the diplomas in the world, he used to say." Thomas felt a dull anger rising within him. What a waste of potential! And yet, hadn't he himself participated in this injustice by seeking a young and malleable wife rather than an equal? "It's not too late," he said impulsively. "You could resume your studies, obtain those diplomas if that's what you want." She raised her eyes to him, a glimmer of hope quickly veiled by pragmatism. "And the estate? The projects we've started? We'll find a way," he promised. "If it's important to you, it's important to me too." These words, spoken almost without thinking, marked a turning point. For the first time, Thomas considered their marriage not as a transaction or convenience, but as a partnership based on mutual respect and shared growth. The rest of the week in New York revealed other facets of Sophie: her mastery of Spanish, German, and Mandarin, learned through books borrowed from the library and conversations with travelers, her intuitive understanding of group dynamics, her ability to memorize complex technical details after a single reading. During a crucial video conference with German investors, she spontaneously intervened when the official interpreter stumbled over specialized terms, translating simultaneously with such fluidity that the Germans began to address her directly, impressed by her eloquence and technical knowledge of European markets. At the end of their New York stay, Thomas made a proposal that would have been unthinkable a few weeks earlier. "I'd like you to come back regularly," he said as they packed their suitcases. "Not as a visitor, but as a consultant. Your outside perspective brings a viewpoint we desperately need." Sophie froze, a silk shirt half folded in her hands. "Are you serious?" "Perfectly serious," he confirmed, "on one condition." "Which is?" she asked, suddenly wary. "That you agree to be paid for your expertise," he said with a smile. "At its true value." The emotion that crossed her face, a mixture of gratitude, pride, and incredulity, was more eloquent than any verbal response. For Sophie, who had never possessed money that wasn't controlled by a man, this proposal represented more than money. It was a recognition of her intrinsic value, her intelligence, her right to autonomy. That evening, for the first time since their marriage, they shared not only the same room but the same bed, finding in physical intimacy the natural expression of a connection that deepened day by day. Back in Napa Valley, they found the mansion in full effervescence. The changes initiated by Sophie in the management of the vineyard estate were beginning to bear fruit. The teams, revitalized by her respectful approach and her in-depth knowledge, worked with renewed enthusiasm. One morning, as the sun was barely rising, Thomas discovered Sophie in the library, surrounded by old dusty documents and maps yellowed by time. "What is all this?" he asked, intrigued by her intense concentration. "Your family's history," she replied, without raising her eyes from a particularly ancient parchment. "I wanted to understand the roots of this estate, what gives it its unique character." Thomas approached, touched by this interest in his heritage. Few people had ever cared about the family history beyond its market value. "Look," she said, showing him a map that appeared to date from the 18th century. "These parcels here, they don't appear on any modern plan of the estate." Thomas leaned in, squinting. Indeed, the map indicated a vineyard area to the northeast of the mansion, where now stood a dense forest considered unusable. "That's strange," he murmured. "These lands must have been abandoned for generations." "Not just abandoned," Sophie specified, extracting another document from the pile, deliberately erased from more recent registers. This report from 1902 mentions a decision by the family to preserve the secret of the ancient vines. Thomas's curiosity fully awakened. What could this forest be hiding? The next day, accompanied by the old Mexican gardener and equipped with machetes, they ventured into the woods. After an hour of difficult progression through the dense vegetation, they emerged into a clearing that left them speechless. Before them stretched rows of wild vines, twisted and gnarled, visibly very old, but still alive. Some stalks had trunks thicker than a man's arm. "Madre mia," breathed the gardener. "They're pre-phylloxera, survivors." Thomas and Sophie exchanged an astonished look. Phylloxera, a parasite that had decimated American vineyards in the late 19th century, had forced winemakers to replant on resistant rootstocks. Original vines, predating this disaster, were exceptionally rare. Why hide them? Thomas wondered aloud. It's an invaluable viticultural treasure. Sophie knelt to examine the soil. "Perhaps because they're planted differently," she suggested. "Look at these configurations. They don't follow the usual lines. They almost seem like a pattern," completed Thomas, stepping back to better see the whole. "Like a constellation." The following days were dedicated to carefully clearing the area and documenting their discovery. Experts were discreetly consulted, confirming the extreme rarity of these vines. Soil analysis revealed unique characteristics, perhaps explaining their miraculous resistance to phylloxera. "We could create an exceptional wine with these grapes," proposed Thomas, already enthusiastic about the idea. But Sophie seemed preoccupied with something else. One evening, as they studied ancient family journals, she let out an exclamation of surprise. "Thomas, look! This entry from 1890. It mentions a secret agreement between your family and mine." Incredulous, he leaned over the document. Indeed, the journal evoked a pact sealed with the Millers of Sonoma to protect the heritage of the celestial vines. "The celestial vines," repeated Sophie, thoughtful. "That's why they're planted in the shape of a constellation. But why our families—" She broke off, frantically scanning other documents until she found what she was looking for. A sepia photograph showing two men in front of the mansion, dated 1888. "That's my great-grandfather," she murmured, pointing to one of the men. "Next to your great-grandfather." Thomas examined the photo with amazement. The two men stood side by side, arm in arm, in a posture suggesting a deep friendship. "Our families were connected," he observed, "long before our marriage." "That's not all," said Sophie, showing him a letter dated 1940. "During the war, your family hid mine in this mansion. They risked their lives to protect us from being interned after Pearl Harbor." A silence charged with emotion settled between them. This marriage that both had initially considered a simple transaction suddenly took on an almost mystical dimension, as if an invisible thread through generations had inexorably led them to each other. "Perhaps some connections are written in the stars," murmured Sophie, "like these vines that draw a constellation." Thomas took her hand, feeling for the first time that their union transcended mere practical considerations. Something deeper united them, a shared heritage, a common history, a destiny perhaps not so accidental. That evening they decided to preserve the secret of the ancient vines, as their ancestors had done, but to make them a symbol of their own renewed alliance, a living testimony that the deepest roots are often invisible, yet still nourish everything that flourishes on the surface. However, it was during the 4th month of their marriage that the true transformation began. Thomas's company faced a major image crisis. A television report had revealed questionable working conditions in their outsourced call centers and outdated environmental practices in their electronic production factories. The case was gaining momentum, social media inflaming with vengeful hashtags, customers threatening to boycott, stock prices dangerously plummeting. Thomas's advisors recommended the usual strategy: firmly deny, counterattack legally, and wait for the media storm to calm down. One evening, as Thomas nervously reviewed crisis reports in his mansion study, Sophie gently knocked on the door. He hesitated before inviting her in. In recent weeks, He had deliberately isolated himself, not wanting to expose her to this professional turmoil. "You should sleep," he said mechanically. Without raising his eyes from the documents, Sophie approached silently, placing a steaming cup of herbal tea near him. "Not before you," she replied simply, glancing at the alarming graphs that wallpapered his desk. Thomas sighed, rubbing his eyes. "This isn't your problem. I'll handle it." "Everything that affects you affects me," she said softly, sitting across from him. "And perhaps I could help." He let out a joyless laugh. "Unless you have a degree in crisis management that I'm unaware of." Sophie didn't respond immediately, taking time to examine the press clippings, analyst reports, strategies proposed by the communications team. "These solutions are all defensive," she finally observed. "They treat the symptoms, not the cause." Thomas looked at her, intrigued despite his skepticism. "And what is the cause, according to you?" "Disconnection," she answered without hesitation. "Your company has focused so much on technology that it has forgotten the human element, both inside and outside." Her words struck him with the force of a long-ignored truth. Wasn't that exactly what he had done in his own life, until Sophie entered it? "What do you suggest?" he asked, suddenly open to a different perspective. Sophie suggested, with a gentle but determined voice, implementing cultural programs that would connect the company to American traditions and local communities. She proposed monthly classical music concerts in the company courtyard, where employees and families could perform, creating an atmosphere of human appreciation. "Music speaks a language everyone understands," she explained. "It humanizes. It creates bridges." Thomas was skeptical, but desperate. "My directors will find it ridiculous." "Perhaps," conceded Sophie, "but ordinary people will understand." Against the unanimous advice of his counselors, Thomas implemented Sophie's suggestions. Instead of denying the problems, the company acknowledged its past mistakes and announced a program of profound transformation. The concerts became the visible emblem of this new approach, attracting media attention for positive reasons this time. The initial resistance of veteran executives dissipated when satisfaction and productivity indices soared. More surprising still, customers responded enthusiastically to this unexpected authenticity. One evening, after a particularly successful concert where Sophie had performed Copland on the piano, accompanied by an engineer on violin and a call center operator on cello, Thomas took her aside. "How did you know?" he asked, genuinely amazed by the success of this unconventional approach. Sophie smiled, observing the crowd slowly dispersing, animated conversations blossoming between people who, before, passed each other without seeing in the aseptic corridors. "People thirst for authenticity," she said simply. "In a world dominated by algorithms and automatisms, they desperately seek genuine connections." Thomas nodded slowly, understanding that this lesson applied to their own relationship as well. This marriage that he had approached as a strategic social transaction had transformed against all expectations into a deep and authentic human connection. That evening, in the intimacy of their bedroom, Thomas confided to Sophie his doubts, his fears, his professional regrets, vulnerabilities he had never shared with anyone before. And she listened, not as the submissive wife he thought he had acquired, but as the equal partner he had been fortunate to discover. The trial by fire had transformed their marriage of convenience into a true alliance founded on mutual trust and deep respect. Without knowing it, in saving Thomas's company, Sophie had also saved their relationship, leading it toward a territory that neither could have imagined a few months earlier. The most surprising discovery occurred in the 6th month of their marriage. Thomas had gone away on a business trip to Chicago, leaving Sophie to supervise the renovation of the east wing of the mansion, long neglected. Examining old plans with the architect, she noticed an inconsistency in the dimensions. "This wall seems thicker than it should be," she observed, comparing the original 18th century plans with the current state. The architect shrugged, probably a later reinforcement. "These old buildings are full of improvised modifications." But Sophie, whose natural curiosity had blossomed since she felt valued, insisted on investigating. Light tapping on the wall indeed revealed a hollow sound at a specific spot. After consultation with a historic restoration expert, a discreet opening was made, revealing a small secret room filled with ancient documents. Among the centuries-old dust and cobwebs, Sophie discovered a cedar wood chest containing bundles of correspondence, notarial deeds, and a meticulously drawn family tree. Examining it in the dim light of a lamp, she let out a cry of amazement. "It's impossible," she murmured, tracing with her finger a particular branch of the tree. When Thomas returned from Chicago 3 days later, he found Sophie in the library, surrounded by a sea of documents arranged in an order that only she seemed to understand. "I've made a discovery," she announced, her eyes bright with excitement. "Something that could change everything." The documents revealed that Sophie was the legitimate heir to a forgotten mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, a 16th-century residence that housed one of the largest collections of Renaissance art in the region. Her family had lost track of this inheritance during the social upheavals of the last century, when an ancestor had to flee America during the Second World War. "According to these deeds, Windward Hall and all its collections belong to you," explained Thomas after having his lawyers examine the documents. "The property is valued at several $1,000,000, not counting the artistic and historical value." Sophie sat down slowly, assimilating this revelation. "I don't understand. Why did no one in my family ever talk about it?" Further research revealed a tragic story. Her grandfather, returning from exile after the war, had tried to reclaim the property but had been thwarted by corrupt officials. Broken by this injustice and determined to protect his family from future disappointments, he had buried the secret, preferring to modestly rebuild their vineyard estate in Sonoma. "It's incredible," murmured Sophie, contemplating a yellowed watercolor depicting Windward Hall in all its Renaissance splendor. "All my life I've dreamed of mansions without knowing I owned one." Thomas watched her carefully, noting the complexity of emotions crossing her face: wonder, sadness for her family's trials, but also a new determination. "What do you intend to do?" he asked gently. Sophie raised her eyes to him, a vision already formed in her mind. "I want to restore it," she said firmly. "Not as a private residence, but as a cultural center that would open its doors to artists, students, history enthusiasts." Thomas smiled, recognizing in this response the very essence of what he admired in her: this capacity to transform personal privileges into collective opportunities. The following weeks were dedicated to legal procedures to officially validate the inheritance. Sophie insisted on visiting the mansion as soon as possible, despite warnings about its state of disrepair. On a foggy November morning, they stood before the rusted gates of Windward Hall. The reality was both worse and more magnificent than they had imagined. The main building, with its elegant turrets and mullioned windows, remained structurally intact despite decades of abandonment. Inside, under the dust and debris, treasures awaited: partially preserved frescoes, carved woodwork, and in a wing miraculously spared from infiltration, nearly 100 paintings and sculptures. "It's as if time stood still," murmured Sophie, brushing with her fingertips an ancient harpsichord. "Everything is here, just waiting to be rediscovered." Thomas, usually pragmatic, found himself sharing her wonder. There was something deeply moving in this resurrection of a past believed forever lost. "The restoration will cost a fortune," he nevertheless warned, assessing the structural damage. "I know," replied Sophie, her gaze traveling the space as if to absorb every detail. "But it's not just a question of money. It's a question of justice, memory, continuity." This discovery created a new bond between them, no longer just husband and wife, but partners in a mission that transcended their personal interests. Thomas mobilized his contacts in the business and cultural worlds, while Sophie immersed herself in the in-depth study of the mansion's history and its collections. The property, officially valued at several $1,000,000, could be transformed into a cultural center that would revolutionize tourism in Rhode Island. But beyond its monetary value, it represented for Sophie a tangible connection to her roots, a validation of the cultural heritage her grandfather had so cherished. One evening, as they studied the restoration plans together, Thomas noticed a silent tear running down Sophie's cheek. "What is it?" he asked gently. "I'm thinking of my grandfather," she replied, her voice slightly trembling. "He died without being able to reclaim what legitimately belonged to him. I wish so much that he could see this, that justice is finally being done." Thomas took her hand in his, understanding that for Sophie, this project had become a form of transgenerational repair, a way to heal a family wound that transcended her own existence. He sees it, he said simply. Through you. This moment of shared vulnerability marked a new turning point in their relationship. The forgotten mansion, with its mixture of splendor and fragility, became the perfect metaphor for their own story. A marriage initially based on social conventions, which progressively revealed unexpected treasures beneath its formal facade. Their relationship deepened when one winter evening, huddled before the monumental fireplace in the salon, Thomas confessed that his fortune was threatened by risky investments in European markets. The flames cast dancing shadows on his face, accentuating the lines that stress had etched in recent months. "I bet too heavily on an emerging technology," he admitted, staring into the fire as if to read his future there. "If these investments collapse, I could lose up to 60% of my liquid assets." Sophie listened attentively, without the interruption or judgment he feared. "I considered our marriage as a way to find emotional stability in troubled times," he continued, finally daring to express this truth he had hidden from himself. "I was seeking a safe harbor while navigating turbulent waters." A silence settled, punctuated only by the crackling of logs in the hearth. Sophie took a sip of wine before responding. "I knew you were hiding something from me," she finally said. "Not necessarily financial problems, but a deep preoccupation. I saw it in your eyes when you thought I wasn't looking." Thomas studied her, surprised by this insight. "You're not angry? To know that our marriage was, in part, a strategy on my part?" Sophie smiled slightly. "How could I blame you when I myself accepted this marriage not out of obligation, as everyone supposes, but by deliberate choice?" It was Thomas's turn to be surprised. "By choice? But your parents?" "My parents suggested this union, yes," she conceded. "But contrary to what you believe, they never forced me. I accepted because I saw in you an authentic goodness behind the businessman facade." She paused, searching for words. "You reminded me of my grandfather, not physically, but in your way of being. That fundamental integrity, even when you try to hide it beneath an appearance of pragmatic cynicism." Thomas felt something unravel within him, a tension he had carried for so long he had forgotten its existence. The idea that Sophie had chosen him, that she had seen something valuable in him beyond his fortune and status, was deeply comforting. "I was 22, not 12, she continued with a touch of humor. "I could have refused, run away, created a scandal. But when I met you during that dinner in San Francisco, I noticed how you treated the staff, with respect, attention. I saw how you truly listened to people, even when they had nothing to offer you." Thomas vaguely remembered that evening, a formal dinner to discuss the terms of the marriage, where he had barely spoken to Sophie, intimidated despite himself by her youth and quiet beauty. "That night you left an extraordinary tip for the valet who had taken care of your car in pouring rain," she recalled. "And you asked after his sick mother, whom you remembered from your last visit 3 months before." "You observed all that?" he marveled. "I always observe," she smiled. "That's what people who are thought invisible do. They see everything." These mutual confessions created a new level of intimacy between them. Both discovered they had married for deeper reasons than they initially imagined, seeking not simply an advantageous social arrangement, but a form of personal redemption, a chance to become better through this union. "What do we do now?" asked Thomas, confronted with the reality of his financial difficulties. "If my investments collapse, then we'll start again," Sophie replied simply. "With Windward Hall, with the vineyards, with what we've built together. Fortune can be lost and rebuilt, Thomas. What can't be replaced is what we've found in each other." That night, nestled in the warmth of their bed while the winter wind howled against the windows, they talked until dawn, no longer as strangers bound by a social contract, but as two souls discovering, amazed, the unexpected depth of their connection. For the first time, Thomas shared his doubts about the meaning of his professional success, his sense of imposture despite his accomplishments, his secret fear of ending up alone despite all his material possessions. Sophie, in turn, revealed her frustrations with the limitations imposed by her gender and social class, her stifled intellectual ambitions, and her ardent desire to create something meaningful in this world. In the shared vulnerability of these confidences, their marriage was transforming, becoming no longer a social facade, but a sanctuary where their true identities could finally breathe freely. The final revelation came in the 12th month of their marriage, on a night when a Santa Ana wind blew through the valley. They had just celebrated their first anniversary with an intimate dinner on the terrace, despite the wind that threatened to overturn the candles. The sky, ink black, was dotted with stars of breathtaking clarity. Thomas had given Sophie an antique pendant, an emerald, surrounded by small diamonds mounted on platinum, belonging to his grandmother. She had accepted it with visible emotion, touching the jewel with her fingertips as if it were a precious talisman. Later, as midnight approached and the wind doubled in intensity, making the mansion's shutters creak like a poorly tuned cello strings, Sophie became strangely silent, her gaze lost in the flickering flames of the fireplace. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked gently, intrigued by this sudden melancholy. She hesitated, as if weighing an important decision. Then, in a voice barely audible above the howling of the wind, she began to tell. "I wasn't completely inexperienced in matters of the heart when I married you," she confessed. "There was Michael." Thomas felt an unexpected pang of jealousy, which he struggled to conceal. "Michael?" Sophie nodded, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "A young cellist I met during a music workshop in Boston. I was 19, he was 22. He had just been accepted to Juilliard." She described an adolescent passion, intense and pure as only first love can be. For 3 summer months, they had loved each other in secret, sharing their love of music, their dreams, their hopes for a life devoted to art. "He played as if his soul was directly connected to his instrument," she murmured, a nostalgic smile on her lips. "I accompanied him on the piano, and sometimes we reached this perfect harmony where the music seemed to flow through us, rather than come from us." Thomas listened, fascinated despite himself by this facet of Sophie he was discovering. He imagined her younger, more vulnerable, vibrant with a first love she believed eternal. "What happened?" he asked, guessing the unhappy ending. "He left to study in New York as planned," she replied, a shadow crossing her face. "We wrote to each other for months. He sent me recordings of his progress. I sent him annotated scores. We had planned that I would join him the following year." She paused, breathing deeply. Then his letters became rarer, shorter. The last one simply said that he had met someone else, a British violinist on exchange at Juilliard, that he was sorry, that I was extraordinary, but that our lives were taking different paths. Thomas observed the emotions crossing her face like clouds in changeable weather, sadness, acceptance, and something that resembled gratitude. "This experience taught me loss and hope," she continued, finally raising her eyes to him. "It shaped my capacity to love with intensity and wisdom, like the songs my grandmother sang during summer evenings, melodies that speak of pain, but also resilience." Thomas took her hand in his, surprised by the absence of jealousy he now felt. On the contrary, he was grateful to this unknown Michael who had, without knowing it, prepared Sophie to love again, to love him, with a depth that only someone who had known loss could offer. "Thank you for telling me," he said simply. Sophie seemed relieved, as if she had carried this secret too long. "I wanted you to know that when I entered this marriage, it wasn't with a virgin heart, but with a healed one, ready to love differently, perhaps more wisely." Thomas felt it was time, too, for him to share a truth he had kept to himself. "I didn't choose you for your innocence, Sophie," he admitted, moved by her honesty. "I chose you for the inner strength I perceived in your hazel eyes from our first meeting." He told her how, behind his apparent search for a young and malleable wife, he had been inexplicably attracted to the quiet determination he sensed in her, this capacity to remain authentically herself despite social pressures. "When our families suggested this union, I accepted for practical reasons, yes," he explained. "But when I saw you, something in me recognized something in you, a resilience, a depth I was seeking without knowing it. That night, lulled by the wind that now seemed to sing rather than howl, they loved each other, not as spouses bound by convention, but as two beings who freely chose each other, in full knowledge of their respective histories, their healed wounds, their strengths and weaknesses." Sophie's first love and Thomas's years of voluntary solitude no longer appeared as obstacles to their connection, but as necessary stages that had prepared them to truly meet, beyond social masks and conventional expectations. The following spring brought a new dynamic to their relationship. Thomas's investments, against all expectations, began to stabilize thanks to an unexpected technological breakthrough. The first phases of Windward Hall's restoration were advancing, revealing architectural treasures that even the experts hadn't anticipated. Sophie, now fully involved in managing the vineyards and transforming the Napa estate, was flourishing in this multiple role: art conservator, wine entrepreneur, and wife of a man she had learned to love deeply. One April morning, as the almond trees exploded in white flowers and the air vibrated with the buzzing of bees, Thomas made a discovery that would add yet another dimension to their shared story. Sorting old family photographs for a digital archiving project, he came across a yellowed image, apparently dating from the 1950s. It showed two young boys in short pants, laughing in front of a fountain he immediately recognized, that of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. On the back, faded writing indicated Thomas and Peter, summer 1957. Thomas remained motionless, his breath caught. Peter, Sophie's father's name, was Peter Miller. "Impossible," he murmured, examining more carefully the face of the second boy. He rushed to Sophie's wedding album, where a photo of her father appeared. Despite the decades of distance, the features were undeniably similar. The same slightly almond-shaped eyes, the same characteristic fold at the corner of the lips. "Sophie," he called, his voice echoing through the corridors of the mansion. He found her in the rose garden in full conversation with the gardener about spring pruning. When she saw his expression, she excused herself to the employee and came to meet him. "What is it?" she asked, concerned by his unusual agitation. Without a word, he handed her the photograph. She took it, confused. Then her eyes widened. "But that's my father," she murmured, incredulous. "As a child. And this boy next to him." "It's me," confirmed Thomas, still shocked by this revelation. "Your father and I were childhood friends." In the 15th month of their marriage, they thus discovered an even deeper and more unexpected connection. Thomas had been the childhood friend of her father, and they had played together in Washington during their youth vacations. Further research revealed that their families had been neighbors in Washington for several summers, before professional differences between their fathers separated them. Peter and Thomas, then 8 and 10 years old, had been forced to interrupt their nascent friendship. "I vaguely remember a friend named Peter," admitted Thomas, searching his memory. "We had built a treehouse in my grandparents' garden. He was already telling me he would become a winemaker like his grandfather." Sophie was fascinated by these tales of a time when her father, whom she had always known as an austere and traditional man, had been a boy full of imagination and dreams. "He never spoke to me about you," she said, thoughtful. "I wonder if he remembered this friendship when he accepted the arrangement for our marriage." Thomas smiled at this idea. Perhaps somewhere in a corner of his memory, he remembered that little boy who promised to become an astronaut or explorer. Fate had woven their paths in mysterious ways, reuniting them decades later through a marriage that seemed arranged, but which was in reality the fulfillment of a promise made between children under the Washington stars. This discovery brought an almost mythical dimension to their union, as if forces greater than themselves had always worked to bring them together across decades and circumstances. One evening, as they dined in the garden fragrant with lavender and rosemary, Sophie proposed an idea that had germinated in her since this revelation. "What if we renewed our vows?" she suggested. "No longer as an arrangement between families, but as a conscious choice in full knowledge of all that binds us, past, present, and future." Thomas was touched by this proposal. Their initial marriage had been a sumptuous but cold ceremony, dictated by social conventions rather than their personal desires. The idea of committing again, this time with their hearts fully open to each other, resonated deeply within him. "I would like that very much," he replied simply, taking her hand across the table. They decided to celebrate this rebirth at the autumn equinox, symbolizing the perfect balance between light and darkness, a new beginning founded on the full acceptance of all they had been through together. This decision marked the beginning of a new phase in their relationship, one in which they were no longer defined by their social roles or initial expectations, but by the deep connection they had forged through trials and discoveries. The Napa mansion, once a symbol of a marriage of convenience, was now becoming the silent witness to an authentic love story that transcended conventions and appearances. The financial crisis came in the 18th month of their marriage. Despite the temporary stabilization of Thomas's investments, a series of regulatory changes in the European Union drastically affected the value of his stocks in the telecommunications sector. Simultaneously, major investors withdrew their support, frightened by market fluctuations. One September morning, Thomas received a call that left him ashen. His financial director announced that several banks were threatening to call in their loans, demanding immediate repayments that the company was not in a position to honor within the imposed deadlines. "We have 3 weeks to find a solution," he explained to Sophie that evening, in the study where they had become accustomed to sharing professional concerns. "Otherwise, I could lose control of the company. Worse still, the mansion and vineyards are included in the guarantees." Sophie listened attentively, her face reflecting not the panic he feared, but intense concentration. Over the previous months, she had familiarized herself with the arcana of Thomas's finances, asking pertinent questions and often offering perspectives that his advisors, too close to the problem, failed to see. "What options do your advisors propose?" she asked calmly. Thomas passed a tired hand over his face. "Sell the Asian division to a Chinese conglomerate, or accept a merger acquisition offer from an American group that has coveted our technology for years." "In both cases, you would lose control," observed Sophie. "Exactly. 25 years of work, to end up as a simple minority shareholder in a company I built with my own hands." Sophie rose and approached the large map of the United States hanging on the wall, where pins marked their various properties: the Napa Mansion, the Sonoma Vineyards, and Windward Hall in Rhode Island, still undergoing restoration. "What if," she said slowly, tracing an invisible line between these points, "we used Windward Hall as collateral for a loan that would buy you time?" Thomas shook his head. "I can't ask you to risk your inheritance for my financial mistakes." It was then that Sophie showed a courage that surprised everyone, including herself. She sat down across from him, determined. "It's not your company or my mansion," she said firmly. "It's our shared future, and I believe we can do better than a simple defensive maneuver." In the days that followed, Sophie developed a bold idea. Using her inheritance as collateral, she proposed a merger between Thomas's business and the cultural project of Windward Hall, creating the first entrepreneurial cultural complex in Rhode Island. "Imagine," she explained during a presentation to Thomas's skeptical advisors, "a center where technological innovation and cultural heritage meet. Where startups develop digital solutions for heritage preservation, where artists collaborate with engineers, where tourists simultaneously discover America's history and future." The idea was radical, blending two worlds usually kept separate, but her vision was so clear, so compelling, that even the most conservative bankers began to see it as a unique opportunity rather than a desperate rescue plan. "It's risky," admitted Thomas during a private discussion. "If it fails, we could lose everything, my company and your mansion." Sophie took his hands in hers, her gaze overflowing with quiet confidence. "Sometimes the greatest risk is not taking one. I believe in this vision. I believe in us." The innovative idea quickly attracted the attention of visionary investors from Boston, looking to diversify their portfolios in projects combining technology and culture. More surprising still, the Department of Cultural Affairs showed interest, seeing in this initiative a potential model for revitalizing other heritage sites in difficulty. The negotiations were intense, often grueling. Sophie revealed an unexpected talent for financial diplomacy, navigating between the contradictory demands of different parties with a natural grace that Thomas observed with growing admiration. One evening, exhausted after a particularly difficult day with the lawyers, they found themselves on the terrace of the Napa Mansion, contemplating the stars that seemed particularly bright. "How did you learn to negotiate like that?" asked Thomas, genuinely curious. Sophie smiled, her face illuminated by the silver glow of the moon. "Growing up in a winemaking family, I observed transactions from the back room. I saw my father bargain with Russian merchants, Japanese importers, New York restaurateurs. Each culture has its own rhythm of negotiation, its own signals. You just need to be attentive." Thomas shook his head, amazed by this woman who never ceased to surprise him. "You should have been CEO, not a CEO's wife. Why not both?" she replied with a mischievous smile that reminded him how much she had gained in confidence since their first meeting. 3 weeks later, the agreement was finalized. The new entity, baptized Heritage and Innovation, secured not only the financial future of Thomas's company, but also opened unprecedented prospects for Windward Hall and its collections. What had begun as an existential crisis had transformed, thanks to Sophie's vision and courage, into an opportunity for reinvention. For the first time in his career, Thomas felt liberated from the crushing weight of being alone at the helm, discovering the liberating power of a genuine partnership. The financial storm, far from overwhelming them, had carried them to unexplored shores, where their combined strengths created something greater than the simple sum of their individual talents. During the 10th month following the restructuring, they faced opposition from certain members of Thomas's family, traditional New Yorkers who saw Sophie's innovations as dangerous threats to carefully preserved entrepreneurial traditions. "A technology company has no place in a Renaissance mansion," argued Robert, Thomas's cousin, during a tense family meeting. "It's a dilution of our industrial heritage, an expensive distraction at a time when we should be refocusing on our core business." Sophie, once intimidated by these family meetings where seniority and status counted more than ideas, now remained serene in the face of criticism. She had learned that some battles are won not with words but with results, and the results were beginning to speak for themselves. 6 months after the launch of the Heritage and Innovation project, the company's profits had increased by 40%. Employee satisfaction reached record levels, attracted by the possibility of working in an exceptional historical setting and inspired by the cultural mission, now added to their business objectives. The cultural center of Windward Hall, partially open to the public while restoration continued, was becoming a European reference, attracting visitors from across the continent to discover the unique fusion of modern business and historical heritage. "Numbers don't lie," Sophie calmly responded to detractors. "Our approach works, not only financially but humanly." What impressed Thomas most was the way Sophie had gradually won over his opponents, not by imposing herself through force or authority, but by patiently demonstrating the validity of her vision through concrete actions. A symbolic turning point came when Robert himself, the fiercest opponent of the project, asked Sophie to advise his own daughter, who wanted to launch a startup combining high fashion and sustainable technologies. "You've proven I was wrong," he admitted with surprising humility. "What you've created isn't a dilution but a necessary evolution." That evening, as they celebrated this small victory in the intimacy of their bedroom, Thomas contemplated his wife with a mixture of admiration and tenderness that continued to deepen. "Do you know what impresses me most about you?" he said, as she untangled her long hair before the antique dressing table. "My incredible talent for pairing wines with desserts," she joked, meeting his gaze in the mirror. "Your ability to transform obstacles into opportunities," he replied seriously, "like a phoenix rising from the ashes." Sophie set down her brush, touched by this observation. "I haven't always been this way," she confessed. "For years I accepted the limitations others imposed on my life, contenting myself with dreaming in secret. What changed?" She reflected for a moment. "This marriage, as strange as it may seem, finding myself in a situation I hadn't entirely chosen, I paradoxically discovered my own agency, as if, by accepting certain constraints, I had been forced to discover an inner freedom I didn't suspect." Thomas understood this paradox perfectly. He too had discovered, through their initially conventional union, an unexpected liberation from the rigid patterns that had defined his life as a solitary businessman. The success of the Heritage and Innovation project culminated with international recognition, when UNESCO selected their initiative as an exemplary model of economically viable cultural preservation. Delegations from around the world began to visit Windward Hall, studying how to replicate this successful marriage between heritage and modernity. For Sophie and Thomas, however, the greatest success was not in the awards or external recognition, but in the profound transformation of their relationship. What had begun as a pragmatic arrangement had metamorphosed into a creative partnership where each pushed the other to surpass their limits to explore new horizons. The evening of the gala, marking the center's first anniversary, while dignitaries and journalists crowded the restored salons of Windward Hall, Thomas found Sophie alone on a terrace, contemplating the Italian garden bathed in moonlight. "Is everything all right?" he asked, joining her momentary solitude. "Perfectly fine," she smiled, naturally taking his hand in hers. "I was just thinking how unpredictable life is. If someone had told me on the day of our wedding that we would be here today." Thomas nodded, sharing this reflection. "Life sometimes gives us gifts disguised as obligations." They remained thus for a moment, savoring the quiet of the garden and the solidity of their connection, before returning to the light and music of the reception. What they didn't know then was that their greatest shared adventure was just beginning. The transformation was completed in the 24th month, when they renewed their vows during an intimate ceremony in the garden of Windward Hall, fully restored and blooming under the June sun. Unlike their first wedding, a grand affair where protocol and traditions had prevailed over authenticity, this celebration was deliberately simple, gathering only their closest friends and family members who had supported their evolution. Sophie wore the same white dress from their first marriage, now embroidered with gold thread by artisans from Rhode Island, each motif telling a chapter of their shared story. Intertwined vines for their shared heritage, musical notes for revealed talents, stars for unexpected discoveries. Her hair, once neatly gathered in a severe chignon, cascaded freely over her shoulders, sprinkled with wildflowers picked at dawn. Thomas had exchanged his usual formal suit for a simple white linen shirt and matching pants. Visibly rejuvenated by authentic happiness, he waited under an arch of antique roses, cultivated from cuttings discovered in the abandoned gardens. The celebrant, an old philosopher friend rather than a religious or civil representative, invited the spouses to share their own vows, no longer dictated by tradition, but springing from their hearts. Thomas took Sophie's hands in his gaze anchored in hers with an intensity that silenced the murmurs of the guests. "When I married you 2 years ago," he began, his voice resonating clearly in the fragrant garden, "I was seeking a companion who would adapt to my life as it was. I never imagined you would transform this life into something so much richer, deeper, truer." He paused, moved. "Today, I no longer promise to protect or guide you. You've proven you need neither. Instead, I promise to be your equal partner in every adventure, your ally in every challenge, your authentic companion at every stage of the journey." Sophie's eyes shone with contained emotions when she took her turn to speak. "2 years ago, I entered this marriage as one enters an unknown house, on tiptoe, respecting rules that others had established," she said, her voice soft but sure. "I promise you not the obedience or submission traditionally expected from a wife, but truth even when it's difficult, challenge when necessary, and a love that doesn't seek to diminish the other to shine, but to elevate us mutually towards our best selves." The ceremony continued with a symbolic ritual where each of the guests added a stone to a spiral sculpture that progressively rose in the center of the garden, a tangible representation of the community that supported and celebrated their renewed union. "Today I return to you in full awareness, freely choosing the love we have built together." She smiled, squeezing his hands. The sun was slowly declining behind the towers of the mansion, bathing the scene in a golden light, when Thomas and Sophie sealed their new vows with a kiss that had nothing conventional or restrained about it, the natural expression of a love that had matured through trials and discoveries. Later in the evening, as music and animated conversations filled the gardens illuminated by hundreds of lanterns, they slipped away hand in hand toward a more isolated part of the estate. "I have something to show you," murmured Sophie, guiding Thomas through a maze of fragrant hedges to a small restored pavilion he hadn't yet visited. Inside, a single object occupied the space, an antique grand piano, perfectly restored. "It's my grandmother's piano," she explained, moved. "The one on which I learned to play. I had it secretly transported from Sonoma to find its place here." Thomas immediately understood the profound significance of this gesture. It wasn't just an instrument, but a symbol of the reconciliation between her past and her present, between what she had been and what she had become. "Would you play for me?" he asked, as he had done that first night in their bedroom 2 years ago. Sophie sat at the piano, but instead of playing immediately, she patted the space beside her on the bench. "No, this time we'll play together." "But I don't know how to play," he protested, surprised. "I'll teach you," she smiled, as my grandmother taught me, note by note, with patience and love. This scene, Sophie gently guiding Thomas's hands on the ivory keys, their laughter when he made mistakes, the candlelight dancing on their concentrated faces, captured the essence of what they had built together. A relationship where each constantly invited the other to explore new territories, to surpass their limits, to discover unexpected joys. After several awkward attempts, they managed to play together a simple but moving melody, Moonlight Sonata, transformed by their imperfect but sincere interpretation into something infinitely precious. "This is how I see our marriage now," Sophie said softly, as the last notes faded into the night, each playing their own part, but creating together a harmony more beautiful than what we could accomplish separately. Thomas took her face in his hands with infinite tenderness. "You have transformed my life, Sophie, not by completely overturning it, but by revealing what was missing: beauty, authenticity, the courage to be vulnerable. And you have transformed mine," she replied, "by giving me the space to discover who I truly am, beyond expectations and conventions." In this isolated pavilion, under the benevolent gaze of stars shining through the glass roof, they sealed their renewed commitment in a more intimate and personal way than any public ceremony could have offered. The young woman who had entered the mansion as a timid bride 2 years earlier had become a visionary entrepreneur, a cultural patron, and a passionate wife. Her initial innocence wasn't naivete, but a purity of intent that had transformed not only her own life, but an entire community. The man who had married her out of social convention had discovered through this unlikely union an emotional depth and capacity for wonder he thought long lost. Their love had blossomed not despite their differences, but thanks to the unique way their qualities complemented each other, creating a partnership no one had foreseen, but which all now admired as the example that the heart always reserves surprises for those courageous enough to open themselves to the infinite possibilities of true love. Like the melody they had just played together, imperfect but authentic, their story continued to be written, note after note, day after day, under the eternal California sun and far beyond.